Hello, we're glad to see that you're back to learn more about the REFramework. So far in this series, we've built a project from scratch using the REFramework template configured to work without queues. However, when it comes to execution monitoring, we're not able to utilize the reporting capabilities of Orchestrator with the project that we've built to date. The purpose of this video is to add a simple reporting feature to our project. Before we can start adding this functionality to the project, naturally, we need to decide what our output execution report will look like. This means deciding what information we want the report to contain, where we'll get that information from, and what format we'll store it in. In our case, we want the execution report to contain the transaction identifier, the field values, and the transaction status, and we'll store the result in an Excel file. This information is made available to the SetTransactionStatus workflow via input arguments. With this in mind, let's start developing. Let's go ahead and create a new Excel file under Data, Output. We'll name it Status. We want to add to the status file some of the useful information that is added to the custom log fields as well. The transaction ID, the transaction field 1, and the transaction status. Let's check the log messages available in the output panel to see them once again. If we double-click a transaction successful or failed message, we'll see all of the log fields: transaction ID, transaction field 1, and transaction status. Let's go back to the Excel file and name the columns transaction ID, fields, and status. Good, no more changes to be made to the Excel file and will be used as a template. Great, let's save it. Next, we need to store the report's file path into the config file. Could you say in which sheet we need to store it? Of course, it's in the settings sheet where we can add the name status file path with its location as a value. Okay, let's save our changes. We're done with configuring the output file. Next, to extract and save the values for each transaction to a local Excel file, let's update the SetTransactionStatus.xaml file. Here, we want to implement the logic of writing a line in the spreadsheet for each transaction processed. To be more specific, we want the line to be written to the Excel file immediately after each transaction is processed. In this way, if the execution terminates unexpectedly, we'll still have the information added to the report. We'll create a separate sequence for this and rename it Write Status to File. And let's connect the appropriate statements. We want all of the branches to lead to the new sequence so that, for example, in case of a business exception, we want it to write this status to the report file. Next, we must set a variable for the status. In the sequence called Success, let's add an assign activity and create a new string-type variable called transaction status inside the to field. For the value, one option is to copy the expression from the above log message activity. This expression calls the value for the log message underscore success key in the constants sheet of the config file. Transaction successful. But if we take a second look at the transaction log fields, we notice that the value is just success. The other option is to simply hardcode success for our transaction status. Since we're here, let's also set the scope of the variable to the global one, SetTransactionStatus. Lastly, we'll rename our assign activity to follow the best practices. Let's copy this activity and paste it in the business exception sequence. Here, we'll set the value to business exception instead of success. We can see the status in the fields collection of the log fields activity. Finally, we'll paste the assign activity in the system exception sequence. Here, we'll type the value application exception. OK, we're all done with the 3 possible outcomes. Let's go back to the write status to file sequence. Note that this workflow is executed for each individual transaction. This means that for each transaction, we'll add the information to a data table containing 1 row and use it to append the Excel file. Let's add an append range activity where we need to specify the workbook path, which is defined as the status file path in the config file. Sheet 1 remains the same, and the data table that we'll create next. For this, we can use build data table activity. As expected, we add the 3 columns named exactly as the ones we defined earlier in our template. OK, and let's save this data to a new variable, TransactionStatus.dt. The next step is to add the data row to TransactionStatus.dt, the output variable for our data table. As we have an array of strings to be added to the data table, our row will be open curly brackets in underscore transaction ID, comma, in underscore transaction field 1, comma, transaction status, close curly brackets. Now all that's left is just to add our data table variable to the append range activity. Each time this sequence is executed, the process rebuilds the data table, adds the data row to it, and then appends the Excel file. We're all done with our changes, so let's save them. One last thing left to do. Let's run the process and see how it performs. As we can see, it closes and reopens the UI demo application and then starts processing the transactions. Quick question, do you remember as part of which state did the framework close and reopen the UI demo application? OK, now that a few transactions are processed, we can stop the execution and close the UI demo application. Let's check our status report. Great, the status of each transaction, along with the transaction ID and transaction values, are written in our report. OK, we're at the end of this demo. We've seen how we can report transaction statuses and other details in an Excel spreadsheet. After watching this video, could you say what custom log fields are added in the framework and where they're used? Also, what steps did we take to write the status of each transaction to an Excel spreadsheet? Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy automation!